got a chance to read your the article that you had published in the Political Research Quarterly,
Mm-hmm.
and I read a little bit of your older book, American Conspiracy Theories. I have not had a chance to read the new book or very much of it yet, and so I was wondering maybe we could start with like what's like your working definition of conspiracy theory and sort of more broadly within political science.
So, to me, a conspiracy theory is an accusatory perception that a small group of powerful people are working in secret for their own benefit and against the common good. And they're doing it in a way that undermines our bedrock ground rules of democracy or hoards vital secrets or commits widespread fraud. So, in this definition, we're going far beyond legal definitions of conspiracy. So, we're not concerned with the wife and the lover who are conspiring to kill the husband to get the insurance money, or the conspiracy to knock over the ice cream truck, to get the till.
So yeah, not just small groups of people working together to commit crime.
Yeah. So illegality isn't that much of an issue here. We're looking at bigger things that might go beyond laws. So, for example, if you said, the Beatles are conspiring to put secret messages in their music that will create an army of teenage communists,
right?
Probably not illegal, but certainly a conspiracy theory in the way I would conceive it.
Okay. So when I was thinking about how I would define it when I was just interrogating myself on this, I sort of think of it as the ultimate political skepticism, I guess, that sits on a continuum of complete fantasy to maybe an accurate representation of how certain tranches of government and the corporate world operate. Now, do you make a distinction at all between your people who are genuine believers of conspiracies and your sort of Paul Krasner type conspiracy hobbyists?
That's hard to do. So a lot of people ask me for the definition of conspiracy theorist.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something where there isn't really an agreed upon usage for that term. So if you can think about the ways in which that would be used. So, for example, you could say anyone who believes any conspiracy theory is a conspiracy theorist. Well, the term would be meaningless at that point because everybody believes in at least one or a few conspiracy theories.
Sure.
You could have it refer to people who believe in a specific conspiracy theory, so 9/11 conspiracy theorists or birther conspiracy theorists, which would give it a little more form. Going further, you could say conspiracy theorists are people who investigate, create, and improve upon conspiracy theories, at least as a hobby. And then you would have people at perhaps the highest level, where you could define it as people who engage in conspiracy theorizing for profit and or power. And that would be your Alex Joneses and your Donald Trump types. But that would be a very small number of people. So if you start out with the most general definition, you have almost no distinction there because everyone falls into it. At the other end, when it's just the people making money off it, it's so few people that it almost doesn't have any meaning either.
So in your own work, that's not really something that you would find a lot of utility to, making that kind of categorical distinction.
No, because in my work, I'm studying mass public opinion. So I'm a lot less concerned with, the Alex Joneses of the world because there's so few of them. I'm more concerned with what do everyday people believe, whether they are trying to spread those ideas or not. What are their beliefs and where do those beliefs come from?
Well, do you not think that there's been a mainstreaming effect by the increased popularity of the Alex Jones type figures and the sort of alt-right InfoWars world.
So your question sort of loaded the front end into the back end.
I'm good at that. I'm good.
So, have conspiracy theories become more mainstream? It depends what you mean by more mainstream. If mainstream means having a president of the United States who engages in a lot of conspiracy rhetoric, then yes. But, if you were to look at web traffic, for example, it's not like the most popular website in the U.S. is InfoWars. It's not, and it's not even close.
Sure.
So mainstream outlets get most of our web traffic, not the fringe conspiracy sites. So the only thing that's really changed between today and some rosy time in the past, as far as I can tell, is that we have a president who's engaging in this. I don't see any evidence at this point, even though it may be true. I just haven't seen evidence that people are believing in conspiracy theories more than they have in the past.
Well, I mean, but I just wonder because I don't. I know that sort of taking sort of general vibes as evidence isn't really good practice, but at the same time, I don't think that. I don't even know if there was a time before Trump was president when the mainstream media would have ever used a term like the deep state, or anyone would refer to these things, that sort of idea, other than maybe saying like the intelligence community or something like that. And to me, that does seem significant. But
you're speaking to the rhetoric used by mainstream media. That's not public opinion. Those are two very different things. And
you don't think it reflects that at all, though?
It might reflect it a little bit, but those aren't the same things.
Okay.
So if I want to know if conspiracy beliefs have increased in the public, I would probably look at polls, not look at what journalists are writing about. I mean, I will agree with you in the sense that journalists are writing about this topic far more than they have in the past. Evidence of this is that I've been running a Google alert for the past, I think, 8 or 9 years on the term conspiracy theory. And back in 2011, 2012, I would get maybe 5 stories a day that would get returned to me with the term conspiracy theory in it, and usually none on Sundays. Now I'm getting more than 100 a day, particularly since Trump got into the race in 2015. So a lot of what's being reported in the media isn't so much a function of beliefs changing; it's a function of the rhetoric used by political elites changing. So because Trump is engaging in so much conspiracy theorizing, the media has to cover not only what he says, but also the rhetoric that's used to counter those conspiracy theories.
But presumably Trump is doing this because he thinks it appeals to some group of people, right?
Yes.
And that would just be his base, I guess, or something.
So he built a coalition using conspiracy theories. So he wasn't going after the same people that Jeb Bush and John Kasich were going after in the Republican primary. He was going after a different kind of Republican. And maybe he was going after, people who were more independent-leaning Republicans, but people who had a conspiratorial mindset, people who were more likely to believe in conspiracy theories and more likely to harbor other views that mainstream Republicans weren't trying to activate, but he did activate those. And now he has a coalition built with these people. So that's why he keeps doing what he is doing.
Okay. Well, why don't we talk about in your study of conspiracy theories, what is the function of them in political discourse?
Well, it depends what you want to use them for, but I tend to see them as a powerful tool. The first use is by people who are either losers or people who are under threat or being accused of something.
Okay.
So think about who's going to use a conspiracy theory. Who's going to say that things were rigged against them or that they were cheated by some shadowy force? Losers, right? The winning team never says we were cheated. the refs were against us. It's the losers who say, we were cheated. If you win an election, you don't say you were cheated. You don't say it was rigged against you. It's the losers who do that. So it's a way to cover up for your own shortcomings. It's a way to deflect criticism. It's also a way to not have to come to grips, with why you failed, or even come to grips with that you failed. You can just blame someone else for your failures. But also, they're a good rhetorical device for people who need to change the playing field because they can't win on the current playing field. So imagine climate change deniers. If you are in favor of climate change, that it's real, what do you have in your favor? We've got the scientists, we've got the data, we've got the best scientists and the best data. But if you're a climate change denier, you don't have those things. So what do? You say, well, the scientists that you have are all involved in some sort of scam. They're all liars, and the data's all faked. So it's a great way to push the accusations, to push everything back onto the other side. So instead of saying, well, what do we do about climate change? In the U.S., we're now saying, can we even trust these phony scientists? And we see this over and over again. So when Harvey Weinstein was accused of all these things that he's accused of, it's reportedly that he said, this is a conspiracy against me. When Bill O'Reilly got in trouble for the harassment that he was, I guess, carrying out, he said, this is the New York Times and Media Matters, and they're all out to get me as part of some plot. So it's a device that people use to sort of push back against accusations, too. And politicians like it. Like Donald Trump, who say, you conspired with Russia, or you did this, or you did that. He says, well, this is a witch hunt. This is a conspiracy against me. So there is use to it by elites in that sense.
Okay, so in your, at least in the article I read, you one quote that I wrote down was, traditional theories of opinion formation can explain much of the variance of conspiratorial belief, and they should not be considered distinct from other species of opinion. Can you maybe elaborate on that for me?
So, since the 1960s, when Richard Hofstadter's work on the paranoid style came out, people have thought of conspiracy theories as almost like a psychological problem. Like, these people are paranoid, they're fringe extremists, and they probably have a whole bunch of mental and social problems that are driving them to adopt these beliefs. And when psychologists started studying much of, conspiracy theories, much of what they were saying was, it's associated with, all sorts of unsavory, ways of thinking, whether it's cognitive problems or paranoia or, delusional thinking or whatnot.
Sure.
So much of the psychological picture wasn't very pretty, but the way that I view them is that is just as any other political opinion, in that they respond to the same forces that other political opinions do. So, if you're a partisan and your trusted partisan leaders come out and say, there's a conspiracy afoot, then you're probably going to believe it, because that's where you get most of your political opinions from in the first place. And if you are someone who takes your political opinions from InfoWars, and they're saying, the frogs are turning gay due to some sort of Monsanto poisoning, then you're going to believe it, because that's where you get your information from, and that's who you trust. And underneath that is the idea that just as Republicans in the mass public respond to Republican elites, and hold Republican opinions because of that, conspiracy-minded people are going to respond to conspiracy theories, they're going to respond to conspiracy theorists, and they're going to be more open to adopting those sorts of opinions.
So it's a predisposition, right?
Yes.
I guess. And that predisposition isn't necessarily ideologically informed. Is that what you're getting at?
Yeah, so I would call it largely separate from traditional left-right identities. So what we find is that this underlying disposition, which we call conspiracy thinking, is essentially, perpendicular to the left-right dimension. So it's not like you become more and more right and then you become a conspiracy nut, or you become more and more left and you become a conspiracy nut. That's not how it works. It's its own separate dimension, and you find equal numbers of conspiracy thinkers on both sides.
Well, do you think, I mean, can you speculate as to what accounts for this and why has it just always existed in one form or another?
So it seems that it's always existed in one form or another, but anything else is largely, you use the right word, speculate. Whereas political scientists have been studying, identities like partisanship and political ideology for, decades and decades, and have, done studies where they follow people over the course of their lifetimes to see how these views develop. We just don't have that yet. With conspiracy thinking. So my assumption is that it develops much like other political identities, like partisanship. Develop from your socialization, solidify as you get older, and then you are what you are. So I think that's what's happening. It's just I don't have any sort of overtime evidence to really show that yet.
Is that something that interests you, like trying to look into that part of the topic more, or are you more interested in the effects that it has on the polity or whatever, so to speak?
I'm interested in somebody else doing it, because I'd be dead by the time I got the results. So if there's some young scholar who wants to study people for the next 50 or 60 years, please start now.
Okay.
And tell me the results when I'm on my deathbed. Yeah.
So are you familiar with a fellow that teaches at FSU in Tallahassee named Lance DeHaven Smith?
I am familiar with his work, yes.
Okay. Now, I guess, for listeners, I suppose, he wrote a book called Conspiracy Theory in America, and I'm in no way going to co-sign with a lot of the stuff that he says, but I do think two useful things that came out of that work. One was sort of tracing the etymology of the term conspiracy theory in the sense that we use it today and it was convincing to me, to sort of CIA counterintelligence in the wake of the JFK assassination, sort of giving talking points, the CIA giving talking points to media outlets, to anyone who sort of skeptical of the Lee Harvey Oswald narrative, to use that term as a derisive, a pejorative, and that, I mean, I think that's if that's the reality, which it seems to me it is, unless someone can prove that otherwise to me. But
well, let me destroy that for you right
yes,
now.
Yes, please.
So the evidence for that is incredibly weak.
Okay.
And so in my edited volume, Conspiracy Theories and the People Who Believe Them, there's a chapter by the Cambridge scholar Andrew Mackenzie McHargue, who's a historian, and he traces the use of that word back, and he finds it well before the 1960s, long before the CIA supposedly wanted to use it as some sort of rhetorical device to shame Kennedy.
Right.
But it first starts popping up as a term of its own, where conspiracy and theory are put together and sort of mean a unique thing, is back in the 1870s, or 1880s, excuse me, around, interestingly, the assassination of another U.S. president, Garfield. And at that time, it actually has a negative connotation to it, too. Well, that's not from the CIA. It's from journalists who are talking about these different theories. Some of them are asserting a conspiracy, and they say these conspiracy theories, and they add a negative connotation to it.
Okay.
No CIA involved in that, and the CIA can make up whatever terms it wants, but we have to understand that words have usages; they don't have inherent connotations. So just because the CIA might want to call someone a conspiracy theorist doesn't mean anyone thinks that that's a bad thing. Okay, that's something that takes place on its own. And if they were able to change what words means in people's minds, well, that would be the biggest MK Ultra experiment ever. It would have to be done on everyone. But even more than that, if that was their plan, let's say that was true, it would be the stupidest, most pointless conspiracy ever, because the JFK conspiracy theories are perhaps the most believed conspiracy theories, because even after just a few months of the assassination, we were already up to 80% of the population believing it. So good luck with the term conspiracy theory dissuading people from believing in conspiracy theories, because it just didn't work. And for decades, belief held solid at around 80%. It's dropped in recent years, but it's still above 50% in most polls.
Yeah, sure. I mean, certainly its success as a counter intel operation, obviously that didn't work. But I mean, anyway, I mean, I do think it's still an interesting, assuming at least what he was saying, what he documented was accurate to at least the context in which he was talking. It is interesting to me. But the other thing that he writes about, that I think potentially has utility is, like, what do you think about the idea of having something that's not called conspiracy theory, like his construct of state crimes against democracy, as a way to talk about, the real, the destructive and often clandestine work of governments and corporations, throughout history, and having the term conspiracy theory maybe sort of repurposed as a term of art just to refer to the sort of the more fantasy world Alex Jones type beliefs. Do you think that is helpful at all as a way to talk about like deep politics or what have you?
No, and that's why I don't subscribe to it.
Okay.
So it's I've read the work, I've read his justification for this term, I've read other authors who prefer that phraseology.
Mm-hmm.
I don't, because I prefer to use terms that are familiar and just make sure that how I use them is clear.
Sure.
To my readers and to my listeners. So
okay.
It to me, it doesn't have any utility, and it's not clear to me where you would make the distinction between what's wacky Alex Jones stuff and what's the more serious stuff. That's mushy. That's just in the eye of the beholder. Because what might be crazy to you be completely sane to somebody else. Right?
Yeah, until something is uncovered, I suppose. But I take your point.
But here's the thing: even the people who believe in the lizard people ruling everything,
right?
They will say, "I have tons of evidence to support my belief, and I believe it because it's true." So how are you going to argue with that?
I mean, that's fair. I totally take your point. Something that you mentioned earlier that I did want to maybe touch on a little bit more, what is this sort of question of mental illness. And because one thing that definitely didn't exist in the 1960s are these, and I'm sure it's a function of it's a product of the internet, right? Are these this community, the gang stalking phenomenon, and these communities of people who refer to themselves as targeted individuals, who essentially put themselves at the center of a web of conspiracies and live a life that seems essentially really tortured by this. And I've talked to some of these people, and at some point I really want to try and dive into this and pinpoint when and where this started. But it is clearly a pathology, but I've talked to these people, and I don't know if it's some form of paraphrenia or what, but they seem like normal people in every other sense of the word, much like maybe how Hofstadter talked about people that believe in stuff. But I don't know how else to describe it other than mental illness, and I'm wondering if this is do you have to disentangle this sort of thing from what you study?
So, can people who believe in a lot of conspiracy theories also suffer from, mental illness or psychopathologies? Sure,
Or
of
like, wouldn't you
course.
want to control for that and study broad studies of this? I suppose.
Sure. So when I do surveys, I'll sometimes ask about, narcissism and sociopathy and, the intent to commit political violence or Machiavellianism, feelings, paranoid feelings. And, so I do that sometimes. The psychologists do that more than I do. But what we tend to find, and I just quoted you numbers about JFK, where if you've got 80% of the population saying, I think, there was a conspiracy killing the president, it's not like 80% of Americans are paranoid or, sociopaths or something like that. Um, so the phenomenon of conspiracy belief goes far beyond the mentally aberrant.
Yeah. Um, I was hoping maybe you could talk a little bit about I know one of your main arguments is that this sort of conspiratorial thinking is either declining or has remained stagnant for over a century and isn't really, despite maybe what the mainstream media is soaked in, that doesn't really reflect what's going on. And but I was wondering if you could talk about maybe the two periods that you point to where there was a legitimate spike in conspiratorial thinking. So the late 19th century and the mid 20th century.
Yeah, so I mean, let me just pose an interesting question before I do that, and that is, what do you think happens if let's say Trump fell into a black hole
Mm-hmm.
tomorrow? What happens? We wind up with Pence as president.
Right.
You're not going to have the crazy rhetoric from uh, the president Pence, and you wouldn't have it from the Republican Party because he would sort of change the direction of that. Or let's say that some normal person was elected president in a couple of years. You're not going to have that rhetoric coming from our political elites, right? So all of a sudden, everything would really change. And what you
Mm-hmm.
would wind up finding, most likely, is um, that elite rhetoric is really pushing a lot of what we are seeing right now, and that this is a product of Donald Trump and certain other political elites, and not a product of a massive change in public opinion towards conspiracy theories. Now, going back to the 1890s, I mean, at that time, in the early 1890s, business was huge and gaining power. There was a lot of fears about monopolies, and um, business hadn't really found a political party for itself yet. And it was in 1896 where McKinley pulls business into um, the Republican coalition. At which point now you have one party, the Republicans, that can't conspiracy theorize about business anymore. So a lot of the spike that we found in the 1890s was really about business. And once Republicans weren't going to conspiracy theorize about them anymore, that came way down. And then in the 1950s, we have both parties freaking out about communists because that was the big fear at the time. You have the Cold War breaking out, you have nuclear weapons, you now have a new bipolar world. As Democrats became less concerned about communism, you really only have one party concerned about communists, so that spike sort of comes down. So, when you have an enemy that everyone's freaking out about, that both parties can spread conspiracy theories about, I suspect it's those times when you will find the big spikes. But
Oh,
when those enemies are only despised by one side or the other, um, it's going to be the conspiracy theory is just going to be limited in their reach.
now, but isn't correct me if I'm wrong, but to map out those spikes, aren't you using like media clipping, like newspaper clippings and stuff, or is there other evidence that you're using?
So there were no polls to go back in time to the
Sure.
1890s. So we used letters to the editor of the New York Times was our main data source. So we got 120,000 letters, about 1,000 letters a year from 1890 to 2010. And I had my assistants read all of them, coding for which ones discussed the conspiracy theory. And we were able to sort of chart those as a percentage of the total letters that we read for each year over time. And then within those conspiracy letters, we then coded them for who's being accused. So was it people on the left, people on the right, business, communists and socialists, some international actor, the media, government, or other?
Okay. And you think that is a more accurate representation of public opinion than like contemporary, I don't know, like internet comments on like a YouTube news clip or something?
No, and I would never do this again.
Okay.
And in fact, the only reason we did it was because we started this, I think a little bit more than 10 years ago, and there was no good way to go about doing this at the time. Okay. So, if we wanted to go back in time to the start of the internet, great. We would have gotten, 10 or 15 years worth of data at that time. But that wasn't really going to give us the sort of variation we wanted over time. So we sort of went with this. Would I encourage other people to do it? No.
Okay.
Do I want to do it again? Never. But it was sort of the best, the best thing I could come up with at the time to sort of, capture both the big and the little fish, and to do that over a sufficient period of time where we'd have variation in all sorts of things, such as who's in power in Congress and in the presidency, what are inequality levels, is there a war going on or not. So, this was sort of it that we were left with. But
have you thought about? Sorry.
As time goes on, we'll be able to find other ways to do this. But at the same time, as time goes on, because we're taking polls now over and over again, we'll probably just be able to stick with polling.
Have you thought about trying to see if this is like cross national? Have you thought about trying to see if this model fits in other countries, historically or contemporarily?
Yeah, so I've been working with a team, and we've been polling across Europe too.
Cool.
To try to see what's, if they do the same things there. Basic findings are this. The U.S. is exceptional in many ways, but not in conspiracy theorizing.
That's not surprising.
Yeah, some countries do it more than us. Some countries do it less than us, and it's not. It's not a uniquely American thing, whereas sometimes people say, oh, the U.S. is, a bunch of conspiracy nuts. No, it's conspiracy theorizing is much more part of the human condition than the American condition. And countries sort of believe in their own, there are certain things specific to each country that lead them to believe in specific conspiracy theories. So, for example, when I ask Americans, think of, a conspiracy theory that might be popular, oftentimes people will say, oh, the moon landing. But the moon landing isn't popular. It's popular in that we know of it as a conspiracy theory. But most Americans don't believe in it. And when we poll on it, we get like 5 or 6%. But in France,
that's definitely a good litmus test for who's allowed to come over for holidays and stuff.
Yeah. Well, when we poll on it in France, you get 18%, so you get a much higher number, because for Americans, the moon landing is a point of national pride. Whereas for the France, they're like, oh yeah, they definitely faked it.
Really? Oh wow.
And you'll find that amongst all sorts of different conspiracy theories, where in some countries they'll be much higher, in other countries they'll be much lower, depending on what that conspiracy theory might have to do with their country or say about them, or how much they've heard about it.
I do want you to be able to plug your new book. So why don't you tell me what sort of information you've compiled in the Conspiracy Theories, a primer that is new or sheds different light on what you had written about before?
So this book, the reason I wrote it was because I teach a class on conspiracy theories, and it's probably the most popular class on campus right now. I have 250 students.
Nice.
So I think it's the biggest class on the UM campus. When I started doing this, there wasn't a textbook for a course like this. But now that there's a lot of professors teaching conspiracy courses and fake news courses, I felt that it was probably a good idea to write one, so I did. The book can be read by anyone, really. So anyone who's interested in the topic can pick it up, and it will make easy sense. There's no prerequisites required or anything like that. And it's about 120 pages of text, so it's a pretty quick read. But I was sort of thinking about what would the value be to somebody who isn't a student in my class, and I think it's this, is that we hear these terms conspiracy theory and conspiracy all the time. But often those terms, can be somewhat confusing, and then oftentimes our debates about, what's true and what's not come down to definitional arguments.
Mm-hmm.
Here I try to really tackle that straight on and go through all the basic terms and concepts to really peel apart, some of the ideas that might be driving what we believe, what we don't believe, so that we're talking about these ideas on firmer footing. And then toward the end of the book, I get into, well, how can we interpret more recent, conspiracy theories and more recent events that seem to have been driven by conspiracy theories, like the Trump-Russia investigation and some of the campaign rhetoric that we hear from contemporary candidates.
I often think that one of the, I'm certainly someone who is very skeptical of official narratives, but I'm in no way. I used to consider myself to be a sort of Paul Krasner style conspiracy hobbyist just because it was interesting, but I have since soured on that because it just seems destructive so much of the time. And one of the things I think about is like how, if the public at large had a more sophisticated understanding of things like social forces that are often mistaken for conspiracies, that would be a good way to kind of undercut their power. But I don't really know how that. Obviously, I'm not a professor or anything. I don't know how to communicate that to the public, but it's something I think about a lot.
Well, there are studies that show that courses in critical thinking can decrease belief in conspiracy theories. So courses in media literacy can also do that too.
Yeah.
But you think about your average high school education from 20, 30 years ago. They weren't teaching people what to believe on the internet because there wasn't an internet. They weren't, I remember when I was in high school, we didn't really have courses on economics or political science or even psychology. So a lot of people aren't getting this sort of stuff. So, they're completely innocent when they come across conspiracy theories. So, if we want to fight it, we really have to be more active in pushing back against the worldviews that are there that sort of accept these ideas when people come into contact with them.
All right. Before I let you go, do you have a favorite conspiracy theory?
I get asked that a lot, and I've always said the same thing. It's so of all the ones I found, I think the one that I always found most interesting was that the CIA had created lesbianism.
Oh, of course.
So, but I hear all the wacky. There's so much wacky stuff that you hear, and to me at this point, I'm largely immune to it. And it's funny when journalists call me about the conspiracy theory du jour. It's like, have you ever heard of anything like this before? And I'm like, yes, yesterday, and the day before, and the day before, and the day before, and it's all the same. It's just a different noun and a different verb, but it's all the same.